Welcome to The Deep Dive. We're the podcast where we really get into the sources behind the headlines, you see.
Yeah, we take a topic, grab the relevant materials, and, well, explore it together with you.
And today, we're looking at something maybe a bit unexpected. It's the story of how an anarchist movement started, really took root in early 20th century Japan.
And we'll be focusing particularly on one key figure, Kotoku Shusui. His own story, his intellectual shifts, they kind of mirror the whole movement's beginnings.
So what are we working with, source-wise?
We've got some good stuff. Excerpts from John Crump's book, The Anarchist Movement in Japan, 1906-1996, which is pretty comprehensive.
Okay.
Then there's a briefing document specifically on Kotoku Shusui and Japanese anarchism. And we've also looked at the Japanese Wikipedia page for some extra biographical background on Kotoku himself.
Great. So our mission, our goal for this deep dive is really to understand how this happened. I mean, anarchism, right? It's about individual liberty, getting rid of the state. How does that square with Meiji Japan, which we often think of as, very hierarchical, very focused on the group, the nation?
That's the core question, isn't it? We want to unpack Kotoku's journey from liberal to social democrat to, full-blown anarchist.
And look at the challenges they faced right from the start. It couldn't have been easy. Okay, let's dive in. Where do we begin?
Well, we really have to set the scene. Think about Japan after 1868, the Meiji Restoration. It was just this whirlwind of change.
Right, modernization at breakneck speed.
Totally. Catching up with the West, industrializing like crazy, building up the military, even starting to build an overseas empire. And all this needed a really strong, centralized government.
So unity and conformity were key then?
Absolutely paramount. State interest came first. And this intense nationalistic feeling with the emperor right at the center was pushed really hard.
And economically, what was happening to ordinary people?
Big changes there, too. New land taxes forced a lot of peasants off their land. They became tenant farmers, and you get the rise of this new industrial working class in the cities. But when they tried to organize,
the state clamped down?
Swiftly and hard.
Yeah.
You had the Public Peace Police Law in 1900, which basically made strikes and serious labor organizing incredibly difficult.
Wow. So not much room for maneuver if you disagreed with the direction things were going. I remember reading about the imperial rescript on education, too.
Oh, yeah, that's crucial. Issued in 1890, it basically laid out the blueprint for the ideal Japanese subject. Loyal to the emperor above all, obedient to laws, willing to sacrifice for the nation. It was all about shaping minds for the state's benefit.
It paints a picture of just immense pressure, this top-down push for unity.
Definitely. But, even under that kind of pressure, you always get people pushing back, looking for alternatives.
And where did they look initially?
Well, some were drawn to Western ideas that seemed to offer something different. Christianity, for instance, with its focus on individual conscience.
Okay.
And also social democracy, the idea of achieving change through politics, through parliament, gradually.
But something shifted.
Yeah, the Russo-Japanese War, 1904-1905. That was a real catalyst for disillusionment for some. Many Christians actually supported the war to gain acceptance.
Right.
And internationally, many social democrats backed Japan, seeing Tsarist Russia as more reactionary. For radicals in Japan who opposed the war and the whole imperial project, this felt like a betrayal. It made those existing ideologies seem, inadequate for the kind of deep change they wanted.
So the war kind of exposed the limits of those approaches for the real radicals.
Exactly. And that's the fertile ground where Japanese anarchism really started to sprout.
Which brings us right to Kotoku Shusui. Tell us about him. He wasn't always an anarchist, he said.
No, not at all. His journey is fascinating. Kotoku Shusui, born Kotoku Denjiro in 1871, Shusui was actually a pen name his mentor gave him, meaning autumn water.
Nice.
He started out influenced by liberalism, became a journalist, quite a prominent one, had a popular column in a radical paper, the Every Morning News, or Yorozu Chush.
Already pushing boundaries, it sounds like.
Definitely. Then he moved towards social democracy. He was involved in trying to set up the Social Democratic Party in 1901.
How did that go?
Banned. Almost immediately. The government shut it down straight away.
Ouch. Another early sign of the state's intolerance?
A very clear sign. And this experience, it must have planted seeds of doubt about working within the system.
I can imagine.
Yeah.
What about the war, the Russo-Japanese War? Where did he stand?
Wow. That was pivotal for him. He took a very strong, principled anti-war stance. His newspaper, the Every Morning News, initially opposed the war too, but then as nationalism surged, the paper switched its position.
And Kotoku?
He refused to compromise. He resigned in protest, even though it meant losing his job and his platform. Real conviction.
That's huge. What did he do next?
He didn't stay quiet. In November 1903, he teamed up with Sakai Toshihiko, another journalist who had also left the paper over the war issue. Together, they launched the common people's newspaper, the Heimin Shinbun.
Explicitly anti-war.
Explicitly anti-war, right in the middle of wartime patriotic fever. So, predictably.
Trouble with the authorities.
Constant trouble. Repeated prosecutions, fines, the editors getting thrown in jail. Kotoku himself did 5 months, February to July 1905, for breaking press laws.
So this paper, the Heimin Shinbun, was it anarchist from day one?
No, not yet. At this stage, it was mainly anti-war and influenced by social democratic ideas, kind of like the German SPD model, aiming for socialism through parliamentary means eventually.
Right.
They even published the first Japanese translation of the Communist Manifesto in 1904.
Wow, really? That must have caused a stir.
Oh yeah, more bans, more fines. They were constantly pushing the limits. But the core ideology was still largely social democratic, not anarchist.
But then came that prison sentence in 1905. You mentioned that was a turning point.
A major one. He later said he went in a Marxist socialist and came out a radical anarchist. Maybe not quite that sudden, but prison was transformative.
What happened in there?
He read Kropotkin, specifically fields, factories, and workshops. Peter Kropotkin, the Russian prince, turned leading anarchist communist.
Right, arguing for decentralized communities, mutual aid.
Exactly. A totally different vision from state socialism or parliamentary politics. And crucially, during this time in prison, Kotoku started to really rethink the emperor's role.
Ah, the emperor. That seems like the third rail of Japanese politics, then.
Absolutely. Unlike, say, the German socialists who mostly sidestepped challenging the monarchy directly, Kotoku realized the emperor wasn't just a symbol. He saw the emperor's system as the absolute bedrock of the Japanese state. Capitalism, militarism, everything he opposed.
So no real change was possible without confronting the emperor's system itself.
That was his conclusion. To truly change Japan, the imperial institution had to go. This is a radical, dangerous thought.
And it led him to leave Japan.
Yes. After getting out of prison, he decided he needed space to think and write freely, especially about the emperor. So November 1905, he heads to the USA for about 6 months.
Why the U.S.?
Freedom of speech, basically. He wanted to criticize the emperor and Japanese institutions openly, without ending up back in jail immediately. He even took Kropotkin's Memoirs of a Revolutionist with him to read on the journey.
So America becomes this sort of intellectual incubator for his anarchism. What specific influences did he pick up there?
You can really point to 3 key things. First, more exposure to anarchist communism. He read more Kropotkin, connected with anarchist communists in California. He even started writing to Kropotkin himself.
Direct contact with the source.
Yeah, and he got hold of Kropotkin's The Conquest of Bread, a really important text outlining the anarchist communist vision. He started translating it, and it was eventually published secretly back in Japan in 1909, becoming hugely influential.
Okay, so deepening his Kropotkinist anarchist communist ideas, what was the second influence?
Syndicalism. He encountered the ideas of the IWW, the Industrial Workers of the World, which had just fallen.
The Wobblies. Radical unionism, direct action.
Exactly. He met IWW members in San Francisco, was impressed by their focus on workers taking direct control, bypassing politics. He also read European syndicalist writings.
Like what?
He translated a pamphlet called The Social General Strike by Siegfried Nacht. It came out in Japan in 1907, slightly retitled to avoid the censors, as The Future of Economic Organization. The idea of the general strike as a revolutionary weapon really grabbed him.
So anarchist communism providing the vision, syndicalism offering a strategy, maybe?
Kind of, yeah. And then there was a third influence, which is perhaps a bit more controversial.
Oh, what was that?
Political terrorism. Not so much from anarchist theory, but from the example of the Russian social revolutionaries, the SRs.
Weren't they the ones assassinating Tsarist officials?
That's them. Their fighting organization carried out these attacks, and some radicals Kotoku met in the U.S. really admired this approach.
And did this influence Japanese activists there?
It did. A small group of Japanese immigrants in Oakland formed the Japanese Social Revolutionary Party, Shakai Kakumeto, in June 1906.
Social Revolutionary Party. Sounds like they were serious.
Their journal, Revolution,
Yeah.
Kakume, was pretty explicit. It talked about armed struggle, bombs being the sole means, and was fiercely critical of the emperor, calling him a tool of the ruling class.
Wow.
And it climaxed with this leaflet issued in the U.S. on the emperor's birthday, November 3rd, 1907. It was called Terrorism and Satsu Shuri. And it directly threatened Emperor Meiji by his personal name, Mutsuhito.
Directly threatening the emperor by name. That must have caused absolute outrage back home.
Immense outrage. He just didn't do that. It crossed a major line, and the Japanese government was furious, determined to crush any hint of such radicalism. That incident would definitely have repercussions later.
So Kotoku comes back to Japan in June 1906, his head full of Kropotkin's syndicalism and these echoes of Russian revolutionary violence. How is he received?
With a lot of interest, there was a big public meeting to welcome him back in Tokyo. He gave a speech, The Tide of the World Revolutionary Movement.
And what was the message?
Down with parliamentarism, up with the general strike. He basically laid out his new anarchist position. Forget voting. Focus on direct action by the workers.
He put that in writing, too.
Oh, yes. A very important article came out in February 1907 called The Change in My Thought on Universal Suffrage. He flat out rejected Parliament, called suffrage meaningless under capitalism, and said the only way forward was direct action by united workers seizing control themselves. No more waiting for politicians.
That's incredibly clear. A total break from his social democratic past. How did his old comrades take it?
Mostly. They were stunned. Many Japanese socialists looked up to the German SPD, saw anarchism as sort of backward,
Right, not scientific.
Exactly. So to see Kotoku, this leading figure, embracing it, it was shocking. People like Katayama Sen, who became a big communist figure later, just dismissed it, thought it was dangerous, unrealistic, would harm the movement.
A real split then. But did his ideas find any takers?
Oh, absolutely. While the old guards were skeptical, a lot of younger socialists were really inspired. People like Shurisaki, Arahata Kansen, who became major anarchists. Later, they were drawn to Kotoku's radical energy, his call for direct action.
Interesting. What was happening organizationally around this time? Was there still a socialist party?
Well, while Kotoku was away in the U.S., they'd actually managed to form another party, the Socialist Party of Japan, Nippon Shikaito, in February 1906.
And the government allowed it this time?
Initially, yes, because the party promised to operate within the limits of the law. So it seemed more moderate, focused on legal means.
Okay.
And the Common People's newspaper was even briefly relaunched as a daily in January 1907. But Kotoku saw this party as, well, a mixed bag. Lots of different ideas, many still leaning towards parliament, partly because they didn't really grasp anarchist communism yet. He felt a big part of his job was education, translation.
It sounds like a collision was inevitable within that party.
Pretty much. The breaking point came at a party conference in February 1907. There was a big debate over Kotoku's ideas, and a motion to ditch that within the limits of the law clause actually got quite a bit of support.
Uh-oh. The government wouldn't like that.
Not at all. Seeing this turn towards radicalism, the government banned the Socialist Party just days later, February 22nd, 1907.
And that was it. The split became final.
That was the definitive split. The Social Democrats and anarchists went their separate ways. When the Daily Common People's newspaper folded in April, it was replaced by two different papers in June. The Social Democratic Social News and the openly anarchist Sasaka Common People's newspaper. Anarchism was now its own distinct movement in Japan.
Okay, so the anarchists are now formally separate, influenced by this blend of ideas. Kotoku brought back anarchist communism, syndicalism, and this awareness of terrorism tactics. What were their main strategies now, and how did the state respond to this newly independent movement?
Well, Kotoku himself was primarily an anarchist communist, deeply influenced by Kropotkin's vision of stateless, cooperative communities. And this idea actually resonated in parts of Japan.
How so?
Japan was still largely agrarian, right?
Yeah.
Anarchist communists saw potential in the existing traditions of village cooperation, especially in things like rice farming, as a kind of basis for future anarchist communes.
Interesting. So connecting theory to existing practices.
Exactly. There was a pamphlet in 1910 by Akaba Hajime called The Farmer's Gospel. It explicitly tried to link traditional village life with anarchist communism, talking about kicking out the landlords, land robbers, he called them, and building anarchism on the foundation of the old village community.
That's a powerful message for rural people. But how did they spread these ideas? Propaganda.
That was the main method for anarchist communists, writing, speaking, meetings. But after the Socialist Party banned in 1907, the state came down incredibly hard.
How hard?
Meetings broken up, publications banned, constant police surveillance, violence, people losing their jobs just for being associated with anarchism. It was intense.
And Akaba Hajime, the author of that pamphlet.
A tragic story. He criticized the emperor in the pamphlet, had to go underground, was eventually caught, and died in prison in 1912 after a hunger strike. It shows the risks involved.
Just brutal repression. What about the syndicalist approach organizing workers?
Syndicalism also had appeal. especially with Japan industrializing and workers, particularly miners, showing real militancy sometimes.
Like the Oshio copper mine strike.
Yes, February 1907 was a famous example of a strike that turned into basically an insurrection, with miners attacking company property, fighting troops. And it wasn't unique.
So worker power seemed like a real possibility.
Well, anarchists welcomed these struggles, obviously. But the problem was the state could usually contain isolated strikes with force. Syndicalist theory required big, coordinated industrial unions to launch a general strike.
But the public peace police law made that almost impossible.
Exactly. Organizing on that scale was incredibly difficult, and labor groups faced even harsher repression than political groups.
So, if propaganda was suppressed and large-scale union organizing was blocked, did that push some towards the third influence Kotoku encountered? Terrorism.
It seems that way for a small minority. Around 1908, with other avenues seeming closed off, some anarchists started thinking about direct attacks, inspired by the Russian SRs.
Did anything actually happen?
Not really. It seems it mostly stayed at the level of discussion and maybe some very basic experiments with making explosives. It was a tiny fraction of the movement.
But the authorities found out.
Yes. In May 1910, police arrested 4 anarchists and found some bomb-making materials. No plot had been carried out, no attack made, but the authorities saw their chance.
To do what?
To crush the movement entirely. They essentially fabricated a massive conspiracy, a plot to assassinate Emperor Meiji, and rounded up 26 people, including Kotoku Shusui. This is the high treason incident, or Kotoku incident.
So, using a minor discovery to justify a huge crackdown based on a fabricated plot.
That's how it looks. The trial, held in secret in December 1910, was a foregone conclusion. The state wanted to eliminate the anarchist threat.
What was the outcome?
All 26 were found guilty. 24 were sentenced to death. Eventually, 12 of those sentences were commuted to life imprisonment, but 12 others, including Kotoku Shusui, were executed.
When?
January 24th, 1911.
A devastating blow. What did that do to the movement?
It basically decimated it, at least for a time. It ushered in what's called the winter period for Japanese anarchism. Journals stopped, meetings were impossible, activists were jailed, forced underground, or into exile like Ishikawa Sanshiro. Things went very quiet.
But did it die out completely?
Amazingly, no. The repression was brutal, the losses were immense, but the ideas, the spirit, somehow persisted, ready to reemerge later. But that early, vibrant phase was brought to a sudden, violent end.
Wow, what a story. So, just to quickly recap, we've seen anarchism bubble up in this rapidly modernizing authoritarian Japan, largely thanks to Kotoku Shusui's incredible intellectual journey and his influence.
Right. We saw the mix of ideas, Kropotkin's communism, syndicalist direct action, even the shadow of political violence, and the different strategies they tried.
And then the state's incredibly harsh reaction, culminating in the high treason incident and the executions, effectively silencing the movement for years. It really highlights the risks of challenging power so directly.
It absolutely does.
Oh.
And it leaves you, the listener, with something to think about, doesn't it? This constant tension between our desire for freedom, for autonomy, and the power the state holds. How do these struggles from over a century ago in Japan connect with movements fighting for change today? What can we learn from the dreams, the strategies, and ultimately the fate of Kotoku Shusui and those early Japanese anarchists?
A really potent question to reflect on. Thank you for guiding us through that complex and quite moving history. And thank you all for joining us on this deep dive. Until next time, keep digging deeper.